President Trump is imposing new tariffs. He says copper imports will soon face a 50% levy, just like steel and
$3.9 billion worth of nickel flows from Sudbury to Detroit, quietly powering America's electric vehicle dreams. Then came August, and with one signature, the man in the White House, who once sold steaks and casinos, decided he knew best how to run a supply chain. Trump's 20% EV tariff didn't just target China. It hit Canada, America's oldest trading partner, its neighbor, its "we watch hockey together" friend. No exemption, no negotiation, just a tax wall tall enough to block common sense. Ottawa's response: not tweets, trade weapons. Because when you choke the lifeline of North America's battery belt, Canada reaches for the defibrillator, or the detonator. The Sudbury-Detroit lifeline. For decades, the nickel vein running from Ontario to Michigan has been the backbone of America's EV industry. Not China, not Russia, Ontario. Each year, 185,000 tons of nickel-copper ore head south, worth over $3.9 billion in cathode material for US battery plants. That's not a trade deficit, it's a lifeline. But try telling that to a president playing Monopoly with tariffs. Here's the math. An 86 kWh battery pack using NMC 811 chemistry contains around 38 kilograms of nickel, 80% of each cell's weight. At today's market rate of $20,400 per ton, that's $775 in nickel per pack. Add Trump's 30% tariff, and that's an extra $230 just for crossing the border, pushing total costs up nearly $1,000 per battery. GM's projected EV margins drop from 10.1% to 8.3%. Analysts say that will wipe out 94,000 EV sales in 2026 alone. That's what happens when protectionism raises prices, cuts profits, and makes American EVs less competitive, while still laying off engineers. Ottawa's 4-point counterstrike. By the end of July, Ottawa wasn't just watching. It was moving chess pieces. The Canadian government quietly rolled out a 4-part strategy designed not for political theatre, but for surgical economic pressure: 15% export tax on raw nickel, targeting US cathode manufacturers who've long relied on duty-free Sudbury metal. Carbon tracking for exports: only Ontario's low-emission nickel, produced with hydro and electrolysis, gets the NAFTA fast lane. Anything dirtier takes the long way around or finds another buyer. $257 million in LFP battery investment, funding research and manufacturing in the Quebec-Ontario corridor to reduce dependence on nickel-heavy chemistries altogether. Tax incentives for Stellantis LG's 20 gigawatt-hours Windsor plant, anchoring high-value cell production firmly on Canadian soil. The Canadian Expenditure Office projects these measures will divert $1.8 billion in exports away from the US to South Korea and the EU by 2027. Clean nickel versus dirty nickel. Here's where the US decision gets even messier. Ontario's refined nickel averages 4.22 tons of CO per ton of metal, thanks to clean hydropower and advanced electrolysis refining. Compare that to Indonesia: 36 tons carbon dioxide per ton of nickel, 9 times dirtier; China: 18 tons carbon dioxide per ton. Starting in 2026, the EU's carbon border tax will add €115 per ton of CO embedded in imports. That means an EV made in the US with dirty nickel could face thousands in extra costs just to enter Europe. In other words, by cutting off Canadian supply, the US is forcing itself to use dirtier nickel, which will make its exports to the EU more expensive, not cheaper. Part 6: Washington's Three Doors. The US now faces 3 realistic paths: exempt Canadian nickel, recognize the strategic value of the Sudbury-Detroit link, waive the tariff, and preserve cost competitiveness. Double down: no exemptions, full tariff pressure, triggering Canada's export tax and a rerouting of supply towards South Korea, Germany, and other non-US buyers. Split the difference: lower tariffs to 20 to 25%, rebuild the Critical Minerals Alliance, and co-develop clean nickel supply security with Ottawa. Analysts currently put 60% odds on the US choosing door 1 or 3. But if the political mood shifts toward hardline protectionism, door 2 could slam shut on decades of cooperation. Part 7: The global shift in motion. While Washington debates, Canada acts. Since March, South Korea's imports of Ontario nickel are up 18%. Germany has signed multi-year supply contracts, locking in secure feedstock for its growing EV sector. Ontario, once primarily a US-oriented exporter, is now actively diversifying. The Sudbury-Detroit lifeline is no longer the only game in town, it's just one of several high-priority routes. If the US keeps building tariff walls, it may find itself on the outside of its own supply chain, watching clean Canadian nickel sail to other continents. Part 8, the closing question. This isn't about Canada losing leverage. It's about Canada realizing it never needed US permission to sell its minerals. In Sudbury, the ore body that's been feeding Detroit since the Cold War is still there, still rich, still clean, still in demand. The only thing that's changed is the buyer list. If the US keeps shutting the door on its allies, how long before they stop knocking? Or maybe, they already have. The Sudbury-Detroit lifeline, from supply chain bedrock to tariff battleground. Part 9, the ghost of 2018, how a trade spat became a strategic pattern. The current nickel dispute didn't come out of nowhere, it has the fingerprints of an older fight. In 2018, the US imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada under national security provisions, shocking Ottawa and infuriating manufacturers in both countries. The lesson then, Washington, tariffs can be a quick political win, even if they alienate allies. Ottawa, never assume friend means exempt. Those tariffs were eventually lifted, but the political muscle memory stayed. When the 2025 EV mineral tariffs were announced, Canadian officials saw the same playbook, only this time, the stakes were higher. Steel you can replace in months, Sudbury-grade nickel you cannot. Part 10, the Detroit boardroom panic. When the tariff news hit, Ford's battery sourcing team reportedly called an emergency meeting within 90 minutes. Minutes from that meeting, seen by multiple trade analysts, outlined the 3-day window Ford believed it had before Canadian suppliers repriced all contracts. GM faced a similar scramble. One exec described the scene as, like watching someone shut off the oxygen in the room. Nobody was worried about finding nickel. They were worried about finding nickel that didn't blow up the EU carbon surcharge. The panic wasn't because the US couldn't buy Indonesian or Philippine nickel, it could. The panic was because switching to that supply meant an automatic competitive disadvantage in markets with strict carbon accounting. Part 11, China's silent win. Ironically, China stands to gain. Beijing has been on a nickel acquisition spree for a decade, buying stakes in Indonesia's massive laterite mines, investing in smelters, and locking up offtake agreements through state-owned giants like Tsingshan Holding Group. By pushing Canada and the US into a tariff fight, the global nickel market subtly shifts. Canadian nickel right-pointing arrow diverted to South Korea, Germany, and Japan. US automakers right-pointing arrow forced into spot market purchases, often from Chinese-controlled supply. In other words, a tariff aimed at reducing Chinese EV dominance could end up increasing US dependence on Chinese intermediaries. Part 12, the Ontario pivot. Sudbury's mining companies aren't just sitting idle. Since Q2 2025, Vale has signed a $740 million, 7-year supply deal with POSCO in South Korea. Glencore is expanding rail links from Sudbury to the Port of Montreal for direct EU exports. Ontario's Ministry of Mines launched the Nickel for Allies program, fast-tracking permits for new mining projects aimed explicitly at non-US buyers. For the first time since the 1960s, Ontario's nickel export strategy does not automatically assume Detroit is the primary customer. Part 13, the carbon ledger problem. Let's break down why EU carbon accounting is the hidden battlefield here. If you ship a Ford Mach-E made with high-carbon Indonesian nickel to Germany in 2027, EU border officials will add carbon dioxide content penalty, €4,140 per ton of nickel. A Ford battery pack with approximately 38 kilograms nickel. That's €157 penalty per car, before shipping. By contrast, a VW ID.4 made with Ontario nickel carries almost no surcharge. That price gap alone could sway thousands of fleet orders, and make US EV exports effectively uncompetitive in Europe. Part 14, Ottawa's unspoken threat. Canadian officials haven't said it out loud, but trade analysts have whispered it since the tariff news. If tensions escalate, Canada could invoke Article 605 of NAFTA's successor, USMCA, which protects certain resource flows but allows reallocation in the event of national interest. Translation: if Ottawa deems it in the national interest to redirect nickel to EU and Asian partners for climate or economic reasons, it has legal room to do so without violating the trade pact. That's the nuclear button, and everyone in Detroit knows it exists. Part 15, the endgame scenarios. By late 2026, this dispute will either be a footnote in the EV transition, resolved through a tariff exemption deal. A structural break, Canada diversifies permanently, the US leans on higher carbon imports, and EV competitiveness suffers. A continental reset, the crisis sparks a North American critical minerals pact, binding Canada, the US, and Mexico into a resource bloc with shared climate standards. Analysts at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence put the odds at, footnote, 35%. Structural break, 40%. Reset, 25%. Part 16, the quiet race against time. Behind the political noise is a clock ticking for Detroit. Every month the tariff stays in place, Canadian suppliers lock in more non-US contracts. Supply relationships in mining are like shipping lanes in wartime. Once they're rerouted, they're hard to reverse. If you found this breakdown useful, stick around. Every week I dig into the hidden supply chains, commodity moves, and policy shifts that decide who wins and loses in the global economy. Outgoing mail, subscribe now so the next trade shock doesn't catch you by surprise, and you'll know exactly who's playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers.